Well, so hello everyone. My name is Andrés, and I am the director of the Cañada Blanch Center here at the LSE. And today we're starting a week that's going to be full of events. And we have Luis Dijkstra, who's going to be talking with us. But before I introduce Luis, I just want to highlight that it's very grateful for all of you that came here. And for all of you that are watching us online and the YouTube channel that Victor, our manager, has set up. So I hope if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send the questions to us. It's my real pleasure to introduce Luis Dijkstra, who is someone who is a good friend of the LSE. He is a visiting professor here, has been for some time. Some of you have already seen him because he came and gave a presentation in the autumn. And for his day-to-day job, he is the head of the economic analysis sector at the Directorate-General of the regional policy of the European Commission. And but even more than that, and I printed his presentation, I printed out the presentation in the bio, and I forgot to bring it. The thing is that he is someone who has been a good friend of all of us who work on development and has pushed us to the limit. If we are where we are, many of us today, is mainly because he actually encouraged people to start measuring things like quality of government. And he said, we don't measure one fundamental factor that determines economic development, in this case in Europe, which is the differences in quality of government. How can we go about measuring them? He was also a massive pioneer in trying to look at the concept of what he's going to do today, which is the concept of traps and development traps. That is, places that are stuck, that cannot move forward, and that have performance in issues like, for example, productivity, employment, and economic growth is well below what it was in the past and where they think they should be. And he's someone that, from the sidelines, has become central in many ways in not just helping most of us to do better research and pushing us to the limit, but also producing significant research himself for many years. And he's going to introduce his latest piece of research in which he's going to look at this title, which is The Geography of Discontent Updated. But more than the geography of discontent is the role of development traps for generating discontent across the whole of Europe. So, Luis, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrés. I hasten to add, this is joint work I will be showing, and a lot of kudos to Andrés for all the work he's already put in. But indeed, my job is to try and understand what drives or what limits regional development, urban development in the EU, and how we can improve it. And in this particular presentation, we're going to focus on why do people vote for Eurosceptic parties. And I'll kick you off with a little overview. So, actually, this is a graph that captures my career at the European Commission. I started in 2001, where hard Eurosceptic votes were very low, 5%. Softer Euroscepticism was around 10%. And right now, softer Euroscepticism is at 26% of the votes in previous parliamentary elections. Can we walk around? Can they still hear me if I walk around? Always have the tendency to want to walk around. I felt like I needed to be in front of the microphone. So here, you can see it. 26% of votes in the last legislative election in the EU27 went for parties that are at least somewhat opposed to EU integration. Here, this is the harder variety of Euroscepticism. That kind of peaked, but the Brexit has given some of those parties maybe cold feet or less appeal. I don't know exactly what to call it, but a lot of them have rebranded themselves. Oh, they're not pro-Frexit or et-exit or Spanexit or whatever you want to call it. They're like, well, we just want to reduce the influence of the EU in our lives. So they have softened their position, but nevertheless, they actually haven't really lost a lot of vote share yet. They're still around 12% of votes, and 12% is significant, right? If you have to create a coalition with that kind of vote share, you can already have an impact on policies, on decisions and on government. So this is clearly something which, as a, I'm a Eurocrat, I work for the European Union, European Commission. I'm worried about the fact that 1 in 4 people vote for a party that wants to reduce what we do, wants to turn back maybe even the clock of EU integration. Oops. Okay. So let's take a quick look. I think you can more or less read it. Your eyes are definitely younger than mine. So what we've done here, all the years from 2000 to 2022, and I've mapped the vote share for here, softer Euroscepticism, so including parties that are somewhat opposed, and the lighter the color, the older the data, the darker the color, the more recent. And so you can see here, this is the cluster early on, from 5 to maybe 12%. And then the more recent years, you can really see that that has gone up, right? Remember that chart. And also, if you look at the countries here, these are the abbreviations, but here you've got Hungary, Italy, Poland, and France, and they're all above or around 50% of the votes went in the legislative election to a party that's at least somewhat Eurosceptic. These are 4 very large countries, very large economies. They have a big impact. Italy and France were part of the first 6 countries that joined what became later the European Union. Hungary and Poland joined in 2004. That's already 18 years ago. We can't really call them new member states, but these countries have a very strong anti-EU vote share in their parliaments. You have a couple here, Malta, Romania, where it's very, very low, 0%. But quite a few, you can quickly get up to 10%, 20%, here plus around 30 and up to 50. So enough to think about what does this mean for the EU, and especially why are we seeing these high shares? Looking at the more harder Eurosceptic, including parties that actually want to leave the EU or turn it into federation of sovereign states, whatever that means. But still, you can see this is where they were a long time ago, around 5%, mostly below. Then the darker colors, again, more recent years, around 12%, even one little peak about 15%. And here, hey, we don't see countries over 50%, but you can clearly see to last election that Italy, close to a third of the votes went to hard Eurosceptic parties. Other countries, Sweden, France, Denmark, Estonia, around the 20% mark. Here you have some more countries who are actually at 0, where there's not a party advocating for such a radical reduction of EU integration or turning back the clock, if you will. But still, in most cases, the darkest values tend to be higher, and the recent value is typically among the highs. So how do we decide if a party is Eurosceptic? Be kind of awkward if I decided that, right? There's hundreds of parties out there. How would I know what a party in Bulgaria thinks about the EU? Fortunately, I don't have to make that decision myself. There's a Chapel Hill expert survey. They have a panel of political experts, multiple experts, and they're asked to rank a party based on their last political program, their agenda for the elections, where they stand on a variety of issues, including what is their position vis-a-vis EU integration. And they use a 7-scale indicator, and then they average the opinion of the different experts together to get a robust, reliable assessment of where they stand. And so here you see the 7 categories and their names. So it starts from strongly in favor, somewhat in favor, neutral. And we look at these last 3 classes, and somewhat opposed, and strongly opposed. So the darkest color is strongly opposed. A lot of countries have a significant share of that. But also some countries don't really have a party that's that strongly opposed. But almost all of them have at least a party that's somewhat opposed, and often also parties that are opposed to EU integration. We put the EU fans in blue in honor of our flag, and there's a lot of blue on this chart, which makes me happy. But there's also a lot of non-blue, where you clearly see that there is some serious concern about the effects of the EU on their livelihoods in their country. One last thing to say, we don't know for every party what their position is. So up here in gray, you see the votes that went to a party that is not coded by Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill only codes parties that have gotten a significant share in the previous elections. So new parties or very small parties or regional or local parties typically don't end up in this database. And because there's so many of them, there's very small, it's very difficult to do. So this share, it's not huge, but 8% at the EU level was not coded according to their opposition to the EU. It might be that these are small anti-EU parties. It might also be that the party has no opinion about the EU, or it might be a local party that's actually very pro-EU. But because we don't know their position, we typically describe this as the minimum share of valid votes for parties that are against the EU. So we can map this, and here we've mapped this at NUTS 3. Both maps follow the same logic. Blue means below the EU average, brown, red means above the EU average. And here on the left, we look at the hard Euroscepticism. And so you can clearly see very high numbers in Italy, but also in the northern ex-industrial regions of France. You can see Eastern Germany, especially the more rural regions, but also in places like the Nordics and even in Estonia, you find above average shares of votes for Eurosceptic parties. If you look at the softer version, then you see two countries completely flipping color, right? It's Poland and Hungary. Their ruling parties, both are anti-EU, at least moderately so. They're also in a very long-standing conflict with the EU about rule of law. And in Hungary, this has even led to the suspension of funding. And that ongoing discussion with Poland is also still about the independence of the judiciary. So it's not just that the parties are against the EU, but there's also an actual conflict about how they are currently managing the independence of their judiciary. If you look closely, for example, in Poland, you can see all the cities are significantly less likely to have a high share of votes for Eurosceptic parties. So these little yellow dots, those are the major cities. Also here you can see Budapest, and also here in Eastern Germany, you can see all the cities that are much more prone to vote pro-EU than anti. So this is the overall picture, and the goal of our paper is to try and understand, okay, given this picture, what could be the reason a particular region has such a high share of Eurosceptic votes? Before we go into the detail, small little point about data. So here, these are the vote shares that we were able to code. And so you can see in virtually all of them were above 80, and most of them were still above 90%, so that's pretty good. And this is the turnout. So how many people of the people who were allowed to vote turned out and gave a valid vote? Now, some countries like Belgium, where I live, it's mandatory to vote, so we were mostly about 90%. But in other places like Romania and Bulgaria, it's below 40%, right? So the turnout is actually really quite low, and this has an impact on the type of parties that get elected. The share of votes for parties changes as the turnout goes down. So, Andrés and I are definitely not the first to be interested in this topic, and there's a lot of literature. There's literature at the individual level where they look, okay, what personal characteristics determine votes for Eurosceptic parties. There's also literature that looks at the spatial component, what types of regions tend to produce more votes for Eurosceptic parties. And so here are, say, a list of the classic indicators that come from this literature. Rural areas typically vote more for Eurosceptic parties. I have a separate paper with some colleagues of mine looking into the differences of of exactly that difference between cities and rural areas. And we see that density of population, the neighborhood density somebody lives in, really has a big impact. In rural areas, you can even see that villages are less likely to vote Eurosceptic than the more dispersed rural areas. Cities, it's the densest cities that vote more pro-EU, and the smaller, less dense cities that vote anti-EU. So within each of those degrees of urbanization, you can see really the population density has an impact. Education, the classic one, high share tertiary education means lower shares of Eurosceptic voting, both at the regional and an individual level. If you look at aging, this is again something you get at the individual level, but also at the regional level. Places that have more people over 65 are more likely to vote anti. Migrants, a lot of debate also in the Brexit literature about the impact of migrants and the pressure they put sometimes put on services, on housing, other aspects, especially in a context of austerity, reduction of public services, reduction in public investment. Low employment rates, people are worried about losing their job, maybe not earning as much as they would if employment rates were higher, and worried about the future. Industrial decline, you'll see many of these parties actively targeting regions in industrial decline. The Rassemblement National, ex-Front National from France, really targets this area, northern France, those ex-industrial regions, which are now confronted with higher unemployment rates, lower employment rates, lower wages, etc. And then another aspect is there's a forward dimension to this. People who are worried about the future are also more likely to vote Eurosceptic. They're worried that the current parties don't take their situation seriously. They see their community deteriorating, and they're worried that in the future there won't be good opportunities where they live. And so they're trying different parties, more extreme parties, to see whether they will be able to make a difference in their community. So this is the classic literature. We try and pick up most of those issues, and we find, and I'll share the results with you in a second, but we add a new dimension to it. This is the development track. Andrés mentioned it earlier. We did a study, well, they did a study that we contracted out for us, where we looked at the impact of lower growth patterns, sustained low growth and productivity, GDP per head, employment rates. And we found that some regions really have struggled with this over time. It's not once or twice, but really very frequently that their performance is much lower compared to the EU, compared to the country, or compared to the region. We included the results, the conclusion of that report in our cohesion report. And one of the key questions that journalists asked us after we published that, okay, tell us more about this development trap. This really resonated with a lot of countries where they recognize that some regions have been in the doldrums for a very long time and are struggling to make that transition to more productive, higher growth activity. So this clearly was an issue, and we continue to investigate this. And here, rather than looking at larger economic regions, we're taking this down to smaller ones, that's 3. So really looking at more, it's not neighborhood level, but it's smaller regions, so closer to the experience of the people in these places. So what are we measuring there? We're measuring first, are they in a development trend? So are they experiencing below average growth rates? We'll also look at how often or they have been in such a trap. And we'll also look whether their performance is much lower than average or whether it's just borderline below the average. So the further below the average it is, the deeper that trap is, if you will. So this is what we call the first index, development trap 1. And here we measure a region's growth, and we measure it at 3 geographies for 3 indicators: GDP per head, labor productivity, and employment over population, employment per head. We look at that for a longer time period because this is not about a shock. This is about a more sustained period of low growth. So we look over a 5-year period. And so we compare the region's growth, that's 3, to that of the EU, to that of the country, or to that of that region in the preceding 5 years. So for 1990, we check, okay, how did they do from 85 to 1990 as compared to 1990 to 1980 to 19. And so here we only started in 2001, but it actually means that we can compare the growth rate 5 years to the ones 10 years, 5 years. And here you see the pattern. You see that, again, these regions just north of Paris that used to have a strong industrial component are frequently have an intense trap. You see some, in Italy, the numbers are quite high. But if you look across the map, you actually find places in pretty much all EU member states that have for a while struggled. So for a while, during the last 20 years, they have struggled to really keep pace with the performance of their neighbors, with the performance of the EU. It's slightly lower in Eastern member states, but you also find clumps of places that don't do so well. Looking at development trap 2, this actually tries to measure the depth of the trap, right? It's not just a question, is your growth rate below average, but it's how far is it below average? And so we're looking at distance, again, for those 3 indicators, GDP per head growth, productivity growth, employment rate growth, and see the bigger that gap is, the deeper the trap is. You're just below average for a couple of years, maybe most people won't notice, but if that gap is substantial, it actually means those gaps between that region and its neighbors, the country, the EU as a whole will be growing. And that will definitely not be something that countries or places don't realize, right? You see the standard of living increasing elsewhere, employment rates, incomes going up everywhere, except where you live. You'll be worried that this was going to be a trend, a pattern, and you're concerned about your income, value your house, finding a job for your children, etc. So looking at the pattern here, you can see it's a little hit or miss. We can see a couple of regions in Croatia, but also Slovenia and Greece that have a very deep development trap. Even in Ireland, you can see a region where it's actually quite a deep trap as compared to the past. And then some of these regions are doing relatively well, the Baltics and Poland, but also here around Paris, you can see a lot of regions, northern Italy, Sicily, but also parts of Portugal and Spain, where there's really a quite deep trap. And of course, this is also then the indicator that we're going to use to see whether this explains some of the patterns that it's. So, just taking a look here at a correlation, pure and simple, without any controls, between hard Eurosceptic votes at the NUTS 3 level and this development trap 1, average over 2001 to 2018, so the longest period that we had. And we see a roughly positive correlation. Doesn't explain a lot of the variation we see, but clearly there is a link. Places that are more trapped, trapped for longer, are more likely to have higher numbers in terms of vote share for Eurosceptic parties. So, one of my previous presentations, I didn't show any regressions, and some of the people in the audience were disappointed by that. So at this time, I'm trying to improve my presentation and then not depriving you of regression tables, but I'll talk you through it. So what did we look at? So these are all the indicators here that are controls. They're kind of classic indicators that you look at. And they roughly give, mostly give the impact that you would expect. So for example, here, quality of government, the index that we started over a decade ago and is now very heavily used and cited. We see that if you have higher quality of government, the vote share for Eurosceptic parties drops. So better quality government, the less likely the population is to vote Eurosceptic. Employment. Higher employment rates reduce Eurosceptic voting. So higher education reduces Eurosceptic voting. Higher density, again, reduces Eurosceptic voting. So these are all the typical examples that you would find. Here, this is one of my favorites. We looked at the share of people born in another EU country or outside the EU. And if you look closely, you'll see they have the opposite impact. People born in a different EU member state people become more relaxed about the EU and are more likely to vote in support of the EU. More people born outside the EU boosts Eurosceptic voting. And you have to know, for a lot of these parties, migration is, one of the topics they hammer on about, illegal migration, migration coming from outside the EU. The irony is, of course, that the EU has very, very little to say about who comes into your country from outside the EU. It's primarily a national prerogative, but it can lead to more Eurosceptic voting. Migration, here we also see a positive impact of net migration over the past 20 years. Reduction in employment of industry. So this is the share of employment in industry. More people working in the industry means more Eurosceptic voting. And here, GDP per head, this is always a bit surprising to me that places that are relatively affluent, even if you control for all of these things, vote Eurosceptic. The only good explanation I have for that one is I call it hubris, the excessive amounts of confidence that they can go it alone. But then, so this more or less confirms what other researchers have found about this issue, but this is the novelty that we're adding here. So we're looking at these development traps at both just the trap level and the intensity level, the depth of the trap. And we can see both of those have a significant impact on Eurosceptic voting. So clearly, not having a lot of growth, growing below average, especially deeply below average, really increases the amount of Eurosceptic voting. And now this one is even more striking. I showed you the table where we saw, okay, over a long period, being in a development trap is not a good idea. Here we compare the length of the trap, or we compare the intensity of the trap over time to the impact on Eurosceptic voting. So let me talk you through it. So here, this is just, we've measured a development trap for 1 year, 2018. We have the election afterwards between 2018 and 2022, and clearly it has a significant impact. Whether you include controls or not, significant impact. If you look at the other extreme here, so here we take that same indicator, relative to the EU average, the country and the region in the past. If you take that over the full period, the impact is almost 7 times higher if you include controls. So that really means that the longer a region is trapped, the bigger the impact is on Eurosceptic voting. And you can just consistently see these numbers going up. The longer the time frame we consider, the higher the impact on Eurosceptic voting. So it's not a one-off thing. It's not what did the most recent year look like. It's like, what did the past 2 decades look like? And if it didn't look good, you're going to see it in the voting. This is another indicator that we've tested. It's the number of years in a trap. It basically, the DTI is a score. How often do you score below? And here we threshold it and said if you have on those 9 indicators, if you score above 5 and above, then you're considered a trap. So here we count simply the number of years. So you can't compare the number, but you can see it's both significant as well. And even just the number of years in a trap since 2010 is also significant. We also looked again at including moderate Euroscepticism or soft Euroscepticism. So these are the votes for all those 3 categories. And here, the last year doesn't even have a significant impact. So 2018, we don't find a statistically significant impact. And the stars here indicate the significance level. But if we look over the entire period, we see it's highly significant. Right? If we look at the impact on moderate Eurosceptic voting of the development trap line over that period, you see a very strong impact both with and without control. So really has an impact for both. This is third paper Andrés and I have been working on. We've first published a geography of discontent, Then we looked at the impact of cohesion policy on votes for Eurosceptic parties, and this is the third one. But because we've done that earlier work, we can also look at national parliamentary elections as a three-level previous way. So we have one where we go from 2013 to 18, and another one where we go from 2018 to 2022. And so if we look and pool that, it's pooled OLS, then we find roughly the same impact for the standard indicators. It's just a few changes. Net migration rate is no longer significant. Quality of government is also no longer significant. And turnout actually reduces Eurosceptic voting, whereas in the other model, it was the opposite. But what we see is that also for that previous, if we combine those waves, both of the development trap indicators remain statistically significant. So really they have had an impact, not just on the most recent parliamentary election in the last 4 years, they've had an impact on all those elections in the last 10 years. So that's really an important lesson that this is a structural phenomenon that development traps clearly have an impact on electoral behavior. So, leaving plenty of time for questions, wanted to wrap up. So, we've asked ourselves the question, we see a big increase in the share of votes for Eurosceptic party, both soft and hard. We wanted to understand what is driving this. Literature indicated a number of indicators, and most of those clearly show an impact, and mostly along the lines that you would expect. But what we're trying to do here is we're trying to add the dimension of the development track, right? So looking at places that have experienced very low growth compared to themselves in the past, compared to other regions in the country, and compared to the EU. And we do this not just for GDP per head, but we do this also for employment rate growth and productivity growth. And we see that in addition to the traditional indicators, has a significant impact. So how the region has performed in the past really changes the electoral results in those regions and can change the coalition that is ruling the future part. And so we've seen that it counts for soft, hard Euroscepticism, previous elections, and the round before. And that really, we need to think about how policies can change to make sure that we address these issues and how we can help places that are stuck in the development track. The report Andrés and colleagues did on that already tries to hint at that. And the idea of a trap is very nice in the sense that it's not easy to get out of a trap. It's not necessarily one thing that you need to change. It's typically a combination of things. In the Cohesion Report, we've also looked at what are the characteristics of a trapped regions, and typically they perform less well in quality of government, but also in innovation, in education. And so these are kind of the aspects that indicate that you need to fix multiple things at the same time to really allow those countries to rebound and recover. For me, also the fact that longer and more intense traps really magnify the impact. Remember that increased sevenfold of the impact, the longer the time period, look at the development trap. This is really worrying because we see that a lot of places are stuck. And we really need to make sure that we find a way of helping those regions to recover some of their livelihood and provide them with a more positive vision of the future. So that's what I wanted to share. I'm very happy to give some time for debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis, for bringing this new ideas and presentation here to the LSE. Questions? Yes, Juan Antonio. Antonio?
I've always thought of Euroscepticism as either you are or you're not. And you said that you established the difference between softer and harder. So my question will be, where do you establish that line? So where does softer end and when does harder begin? Because I've never heard of this separation.
So for me, to take a metaphor, soft Euroscepticism is a party that's riding a brake. right? They want to slow down EU integration. They don't want to add too much. They like it the way it is, but really, please don't come up with any new proposals. Whereas hard Euroscepticism, they're trying to change the direction of the car. They're trying to go back. So they're really trying to roll back any kind of common policies. And the really hard ones are the ones that leave the EU entirely, right? And so there are parties out there that are actively advocating for leaving the EU. Those are quite clear. But you also have a number of parties that really say, well, we want to almost, how to put it, take the EU apart in the sense that really reduce its power, reduce its influence, reduce the number of policies it works on, and try and eliminate some of the coordination that we do or some of the policies that we develop jointly. So that would be definitely within the hard. A number of conservative parties, typically on the right, are more like, okay, the EU is useful, we like the single market, but let's not do too much of the other stuff. So they're more or less inclined to really stop EU integration, whereas the harder ones really want to reverse it.
More questions? Yes, go ahead.
What was the name of the, I think you said it was in Chapel Hill that did the data on that?
It's the Chapel Hill Expert Survey, and it's abbreviated to CHESS, but with one S. You Google EU CHESS, you should find it. Chapel Hill.
Lara?
Would you perhaps know how the data on Euroscepticism looked in the UK before Brexit happened?
Yes. Actually, the first paper we did included the UK. And there we found typically, the London, all the cities voted for staying. Scotland famously voted for staying. But the poor, the more rural parts of the UK voted to leave, including places like Wales and Cornwall, where historically the EU provided a lot of investment to try and help them develop. So, and the north of England also voted for leave. In part, this is the effect you would expect from a development trap, right? These places have struggled for a long time, and the current policies in their eyes are not working well enough, so they're trying for a more radical type of medicine. You had a follow-up question?
Yeah, would you be able to compare it with any of the countries that we see now on the graph? Are any of the countries showing similar symptoms? I guess.
In other words, we have a risk of another country leaving.
I'm half British, half Dutch. I was quite upset by the referendum and the consequences of that. So I don't hope we'll lose another member state. I don't see any appetite right now in any countries to really push it. But I would argue that UK leaving, I wouldn't call it an accident, but it wasn't inevitable. And it's almost happenstantial. It was very on the knife's edge. A lot of people were very confident that Remain was going to win. A lot of people didn't turn out to vote because they didn't think it was necessary, because their preferred option was going to win. And even now, you are seeing a change in the attitude towards the EU. I think one of the failures of the EU is that we are a horribly complicated machinery which people don't really understand, and they don't really know what we're trying to do or what the point of this union. And so for me, one of the conclusions I drew from the first paper is really we need to come with a far clearer and shared and common narrative of why do we have the EU and what is it trying to achieve. But having said that, if you look, I pointed out 4 countries: Poland, France, Italy, Hungary, and they have over 50%, at least moderate Eurosceptic voting. In the case of Hungary and Poland, they get so much funding from us that I don't think any government is going to say, well, thank you, but no thanks. And I also don't think the public opinion would be in support of leaving. But you do see, especially in Hungary, a tendency to vilify the EU for good reasons, or even better, for bad reasons, or for wrong reasons that are not true. And that's a very slippery slope because, the largest part of the public is not that interested in the EU. It'll follow what the most popular media says. And if the popular media is under control of the government and spreads stories which are half-truths or worse, then you end up with a situation where the dominant narrative is one of like, oh, the EU is a joke, the EU is not necessary. And that's definitely something you can see in the parallels with the UK. The UK had a long tradition of both politicians, but also, tabloids that made fun of the EU. Former prime minister wrote many of those columns in the tabloids about how ridiculous the EU was. So I think that's a high-risk strategy. The other thing, which for me is a high-risk strategy, is that we have, for the longest time, been very willing to be the scapegoat. Countries would come to Brussels, the government would come to Brussels, they would vote behind closed doors in support of something, and that was not popular, but they all agreed on the necessity for it. And then they would go home and say, oh, look at what Brussels is making us do. In the short run, that buys you time and buys you the opportunity to get certain decisions through that you need. But in the long run, obviously, it undermines the support and the credibility of the EU. So again, I think more transparency about what actually is supported by the various governments and a clearer understanding that for most issues, countries have veto power, right? We're a very thin, small version of a government. We're bigger than other international organizations relative to the size of the EU. But compared to any national or regional government, we're tiny. I mean, governments spend 40–50% of GDP. We get less than 1%. So there is a scale issue there. So those are kind of the conclusions I would draw from the comparison with the UK. But I'm not convinced that we won't lose another one. I think it's definitely possible. And there are countries actively trying to undermine the popular opinion of what the EU does. But I don't see any of them actually leaving in the short term.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah, it was partly addressed by your answer, but I was wondering, like, particularly in the regions in the development trap, is the EU discontent just like the incremental sort of consequence of discontent with politics in general? So is this something EU specific, or is this just like you are at the end of the road and just like you end up with the worst part of the cake in a way?
Now, that's a very good question. And Andrés and I were earlier discussing that for the paper exactly. Is this collateral damage, or is this really something that says something about how the EU is perceived? I would argue it's more than collateral damage. It's a bit of an interaction. If you look at populist parties, they love a good scapegoat. Hey, here we've got an international organization. We can blame for everything that's wrong. And people buy it, right? And you see also that trust in the EU has dropped significantly. And if you look at the timing of the rise of that Eurosceptic voting, that happened after the economic and financial crisis of 2008. That really undermined people's trust in national governments, but also in the EU government. And so populists love a good scapegoat, and they are blaming the EU. And as a result, you get, you get feedback in the sense that you have a party that promotes the idea that the EU is a bad idea. They get more votes, they promote that more, people start buying the idea, they get more votes. So there's definitely, we're part of that message, and we're part of how they try and get their vote share to increase. I'm not sure that for all the voters, it's the most salient issue, but in many cases, it is a very clear and vocal part of their platform. Some cases maybe less so, but in many cases, it's a very prominent part of their agenda. In the Chapel Hill expert survey, you can also check the salience of the EU to see the party might be against the EU, but might not be very important for their campaign, or it could be a very central part of their campaign. So that's an empirical way of checking whether this is the case. But we also looked at, say, the correlation between trust in the EU and Eurosceptic voting, and we clearly find that higher trust in the EU translates into lower Eurosceptic voting. At the national level, we don't have the regional data, but that does suggest that there is a link, interaction between those votes and then the level of trust.
More questions? Yes, Alexei?
Yes, thank you.
No.
You first. Okay. Yeah, if I may, Louis, two questions connected to two things I inherit. First one is more of a question on behalf of RAP's program. So, like, how urban development trap behavior varies from rural trap behavior.
Well, you're one of the ones that has promoted a new definition of cities and rural areas and.
Perfect question. So, for the development trap, we actually haven't done the analysis yet. So I haven't looked at whether urban regions or rural regions are more likely to be trapped or if the traps are deeper. My expectation would be that yes, it is more likely to occur in smaller regions and more rural regions, basically because they have a less diversified economy. They're more likely to be dominated by one single employer. If that one gets hit, it's much harder to bounce back. So this is my educated guess of something that I haven't empirically verified, but we have all the data and we can easily check that. In terms of the definition, yes, we've developed together with the OECD a number of definitions to define what is urban and what is rural. We apply that at the grid level, at the local level, the regional level, so that we now can do harmonized comparison of urbanization in the EU and even globally, because this was also endorsed by the UN. So with one of my hats, I'm trying to promote countries like Kenya and Mozambique to apply this definition to their country.
You had a second question?
Yeah, second is more esoteric and connected to Ukraine. So, how opposition to enlargement and not the EU itself may correlate with development traps, and how probably you haven't researched that, but then how could it be, and what could be your ideas, and maybe like to point to some tracks to some route to how we may look at it is Netherlands referendum on association agreement, for instance. Yeah.
No, that's a good question. Let me say two things about it. If you look at, say, the kind of economic priorities of a lot of the Eurosceptic parties, they tend to be anti-trade. They tend to be very protectionistic, and for them, the option of adding another poorer member state to the single market might be considered quite a threat. So I would expect quite some resistance among some of those parties to further enlargement. From a political point of view, governments kind of play that in a different way. Some of the softer Eurosceptic parties, and notably the UK, were incredibly pro-enlargement, because it would dilute the EU. It would reduce the efforts for further integration, distract them, and make it much harder to coordinate policy. So the EU would remain a single market plus a few other policies, and so they tended to be quite pro-enlargement. I think the current Commission is very pro-enlargement, made it very clear that this is a value that we share and we want to embrace not just Ukraine, but also the Western Balkan. I think it is not easy to join the EU. There's a lot of things that need to change, but I think there's a clear appetite to make that happen. So what do we do to soften the impact economically on richer regions of a poor member state joining? Is actually through cohesion policy, we try and promote growth in those places so that not only will they, maybe create goods that can be exported to the rest of the EU, they also start importing goods produced in the EU or in the initial EU, if you will. So through cohesion policy, for example, we see that by investing in Romania and Bulgaria, a lot of those regions then actually turn around and buy products from Germany, from France, to supply their factories or their firms or their households. So reducing, investments that reduce the gaps in development within the EU make it easier to absorb, basically is the long story there. And there's still a very strong support that this is one of the key mandates of the EU. It's also in our treaty, the reduction of regional economic disparities. And in a way, I think that should facilitate the integration of poorer member states in the EU.
We have a question from the YouTube channel, but before we go there, and just to realize that we do have questions coming online, Giovanni has his hand raised, so Giovanni, please go ahead.
Thanks. So I was wondering how much does the territorial issue weights as compared to the other factors you listed before? Because I come from a small village in mountains in central Italy, and when I talk to my friends there who all remain there, they basically massively voted for Eurosceptical or against globalization parties. And I can clearly see there a territorial issue, because either they didn't want to move or they couldn't want to move. So basically they were like looking for jobs, for proper long-term jobs there, and hoping for someone to go and bring jobs there. Unlike me, who moved elsewhere. So there was really a territorial issue there. But then, of course, there may be other factors as well, like you said, level of education, etc., etc. So have you got any idea of how much that weights in terms of comparison with the other, or if there's some trend? My perception is that has increased after the crisis, especially my perception as an Italian after 2011 with the debt crisis. Probably increased a lot, but have you any idea on that?
No, it's a good question. We see it to some extent. The fact that urban areas are more pro-EU and rural areas are less pro-EU is a reflection of the fact that most rural areas don't get a significant inflow of migrants, right? Many rural areas actually see an outflow of migrants, and as a result, they also see a reduction in their population. For the previous paper, we tested whether population change had an impact, expecting a reduction of population to boost Eurosceptic voting. We didn't find a particularly strong pattern. We looked at net migration, but there we did find that net out migration increases Eurosceptic voting, net in migration reduces it. So a bit of the demographic dynamism is captured there. I think one area where you do see that is the worries about the future. People who stayed in a place and they feel like it's not very dynamic, obviously will worry about the opportunities today, but also in the future. So it would be great to find a good indicator that captured that. I would love to know, share a population that lives within 5 kilometers of where they were born, for example, or really a definition that captures how far people have moved from where they grew up. But I haven't found a good one. So we have country of birth, but I don't have, for example, region of birth. Right? It'd be very interesting to look at that. I do think there is something about mentalities there and the familiarity or not of seeing new people arrive. What we saw in the Brexit vote was that areas that didn't have a very high level of foreign-born, but saw a big increase in the share of foreign-born, voted more pro-Brexit, so for Leave. That would be one of the dynamics. But it's a tricky one to capture well, but I would expect from what we've done already that there is definitely an influence, which you see primarily more strongly in rural areas than you would in urban.
Dijkstra, can you please take us to the audience?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions from the audience. I will put them together because they deal with the future.
Okay.
One of them is by Gregors and the other one is by Violeta Killer, Dr. Violeta Killer, who will be a member in one of the Center in 1 Week fellow. Visiting fellow of the Center in 1 Week. And they are about how do we get out of this development trap. That is more kind of big question. But the other one is what can the EU do for it? I mean, regarding the EU funds for the 2021-2027 policy for these development traps.
So first question, what can you do to get out of a development trap? When we've looked at that in the past, we clearly saw that the business environment, quality of government in trapped regions is lower. So these are eminently fixable things. They don't happen overnight, but you can make an administration more transparent, you can make it more efficient, and you can make it more business friendly. And that's not, I'm not talking about tax cuts, but I'm just talking about streamlining procedures, moving them all online, making sure that there's no soft payments requirement or informal payments. And this is something that you can measure, you can check over time. And the EU actually has increased its attention for quality of government issues, trying much harder to reduce corruptions and making administrative procedures digital, more efficient, faster, more reliable, to really facilitate people who want to start a new business and allow them to grow. So, I think business environment is a key one. When it comes to other aspects, I think innovation and education are two very important aspects as well. If you look at the trapped regions, they tend to have lower patenting, lower innovation, lower R&D, lower scores in the regional innovation scoreboard, etc. So that is not destiny. You can change that, but it's a question of, it's not something that you can change independently. So it's really important to make sure that the education that you're providing, the training you're providing is relevant for the companies that are present in your region or that may want to expand in the region or move to the region. So really you need to find a way of providing that training and that education that's really relevant for the local economic fabric, right? And so that's another key goal. Lastly, I think it's really important to change somehow the perception of a region. I mean, Andrés talks about the places that don't matter. And unfortunately, there are definitely people who feel that the place they live in doesn't matter, right? And so if we can show both in our actions, but also in our words and our discourses that we're committed to helping other regions, and especially the ones that are struggling to come back, I think that can also help change people's minds, their hopes for the future. Can the EU fix that? Not at all. No, definitely not. Can cohesion policy fix that? Not at all. But we can do things already now. And also towards the future. I mean, one of the big debates is what to do about places that are in decline. One of our treaty articles actually mentions places, industrial areas in industrial decline. So it's not a new concern. Right now, cohesion policy is primarily focused on regions with a low level of economic development. But for the future, we could also consider paying more attention, and not just attention, but also providing more funding that places that have been slipping down. The difficulty really is also that you need a strategy that covers all the relevant issues. In some places, you might need more investments in hardware, say broadband infrastructure, or in some places even transport infrastructure. But in other places, all that might be already there, but it's more of a question of trying to help new entrepreneurs, new startups, and allow the existing companies to flourish and grow. So there's no magic wand to like do this and it gets fixed. But I think national policies, EU policies, we can all help. To give maybe one example, which is a bit of a far-fetched one, but I think it's important. For me, one of the aspects which I read into this situation is that these places have a lack of voice. A lot of people there will say that my voice doesn't matter, it doesn't matter in national government, doesn't matter to the EU. And so they feel a lower level of agency. They can't fix this. And in many ways, I think that is part of the problem. If we can activate them, if we can allow them to participate in decisions, if we can give them the means to help co-design the strategy for redevelopment, they would have a greater sense of agency. They would feel that their voice actually mattered. And so the participation in the design of policy and strategies, for me, is a very important one. There's one small project called the Long-Term Vision for Rural Areas in the EU, where it was explicitly a goal of trying to make sure that the rural voices were heard, that we understood what they were needing, what they were wanted. And so this was a way of trying to reach out to a community that felt neglected and felt ignored. So this is going to transform EU rural areas? No. But it's at least an acknowledgement that we are aware that some groups in some places feel that their voices don't get heard.
Any more questions coming from?
Not from.
Giovanni, please
Sorry,
go ahead.
another
Sorry,
one.
go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
No, but Giovanni, go ahead and then we'll go.
Second one, sorry, and last. If we just focus on very micro level, like at urban level, and in terms of the center peripheral dichotomy, would you say if there's a difference in voting between the centers and peripheries of urban areas, depending on how dynamic the area is? I mean, I expect, for example, like if I take an example from the US, San Francisco or Detroit, or in Italy, Milan and Naples. I mean, at least at the Italian level, I know the center of Milan and the center of Naples were less prone to vote Eurosceptical, but then like, what about the suburbs? Like people who live around Milan, do they sort of still gain from the dynamism the poll generates, or not really?
It's a good question. I mean, I haven't looked at it at that scale level. The previous paper we did look in many countries at very small electoral districts. You get a bit of a mix. It depends also where the educated and the affluent live. And that differs from one city to another. In many US cities, they live on the outskirts. And given that higher education tends to boost populist voting. But the difficulty with Eurosceptic voting is that there's also definitely a large contingent of relatively confident and affluent people who vote Eurosceptic. So it's hard to know. So I don't see a single picture emerging from, say, from the city center to the suburbs. I think it really depends on how, say, a city is structured, socioeconomically speaking.
No?
Hi, Luis. My question is, like, since resources are quite limited, things like innovation, education are very costly. So there are already many countries in the development trap. So will the future enlargement of EU, especially with less developed countries joining, make the current development trap deeper and last longer, and like a vicious cycle, make the anti-EU more and more dominant?
Excellent question. Thank you. Do I think less developed countries joining the EU will make the development trap worse? Actually, if we look at where the development trap is mostly concentrated, it's not in the less developed countries and regions. In Poland, in Romania, in Bulgaria, the development trap is relatively rare. Most of those regions are doing all right, and some are doing extremely well. It is true that in those countries, you see a big difference between the urban and the rural growth rates. The capitals often grow at a spectacular rate. But all the other places actually are catching up. They are growing quite fast, typically faster than the EU, maybe not faster than the country as a whole, but they're not going to struggle in the short term. What we worry mostly about these places is that in the medium term, once they get to the levels of income where your expectation of the business environment and your acceptance of corruption is a lot lower, and then they need to have already made that transition to be able to continue to grow. So I don't think Western Balkan countries joining would actually lead to more traps, but it would reinforce the challenge of countries and regions at a certain point will bump into this frontier where they really need to have a much more attractive business environment and much more support for innovation and education to be able to continue to grow. Whether this would have an impact on, say, the trapped regions in Germany or France, not sure. I don't necessarily see a negative feedback there. There is a lot of debate about whether new countries will actually lead to a faster deindustrialization of the more affluent member states. Data is a bit mixed to say a big impact. A lot of those changes would happen anyway because of the technological change. So a lot of it is about the technologies that you use. There is definitely an element of some companies moving to other parts of the EU. But it's an open question whether that wouldn't have happened anyway. I mean, those companies may have gone bust if it weren't for the opportunity to move to a cheaper member state. So it's quite hard to do the counterfactual. So for me, the development trap is clearly something that we need to address, but in the short term is not something that would be exacerbated by new poor countries joining.
Any other questions coming from the audience here? Yes, well, Max first and then.
Sorry, do you have any thoughts on what the US is doing to target the left behind places there with its industrial strategy now? And also, I mean, second to that, the UK and its levelling up kind of agenda.
Let me start with the UK. I looked at the levelling up white paper. I was actually the Department for Leveling Up earlier today to talk to somebody there. I've already kind of emphasized it, right? That there is a rhetorical element here. There's a discourse that is important. And I think the Leveling Up campaign hit the nail on the head of what the discourse was required. And I think it captures people's imagination. It might have also allowed Conservatives to capture more votes, but it can't just be discourse. It really needs to be followed through with a strong commitment, both financial and otherwise, to make long-term change happen in those places. If I looked at the Leveling Up white paper, I didn't see big numbers in terms of funding linked to it. I also didn't see an understanding of what the right scale is to address this. I felt like they were thinking about addressing part of a small geographical scale. We need places that are big enough to actually make a difference with some clout, some capacity to implement an investment strategy. So being very brutal, leveling up, saying the right things, but not backing it up with enough commitment. And the fact that we've already had two new prime ministers doesn't help, right? And the tighter financial situation and the poor economic prospects of the UK is going to make all of this a lot harder to achieve. But then moving from the UK to the US, we're moving from a context where a lot of funding is generated centrally, nationally, and then redistributed to a place where the opposite is the case, right? The US is incredibly decentralized. It's a federation, it's a federal state. But on top of that, a lot of services are paid for locally based on local revenue, local income taxes, or primarily housing taxes. And that generates far more vicious cycles that if you have a poor place, then the schools are going to be poor and the streets are going to be poorly maintained. And that kind of drives away people who like pretty streets and like good schools and can afford to move, and then you get even lower tax base. So you can clearly see that kind of negative spiral happening in a lot of places in the US. I do hear some rhetoric about helping left behind places and places in industrial decline, but I wouldn't expect any of those to fundamentally alter the fact that most of the services have to be paid for by the local firms and residents. And without some kind of counterbalancing of that, it's very difficult to break that kind of cycle. If you look at, say, the Nordic countries, yes, a significant share of revenue is generated locally, but there's also a formula to kind of counterbalance the lack of funding in some places with the funding coming from other places. And that's something the US fundamentally doesn't do. And do I see, an attempt to federally say, okay, let's invest in long-term development strategy for the poorest places in the US? No. Not to my knowledge. There's a lot of different separate sectoral policies, there's rural policy, but there's nothing even remotely close to, for example,
Dijkstra.
Yeah. I was just going back to the question of the relationship between the development trap and the voting for the Eurosceptic parties. I buy the story, but and I kind of share it, but there's some things I'm thinking that For example, some of these regions have been in a development trap for not 15 years, that is the span of the study. They've been there for like 30 years in a development trap. And the Euroscepticism has gone like 5 years ago. What my question is, do the development trap or the existence of the lens explain the timing? And you said it sometimes like is the economic crisis, no? It's triggered. So I just want to.
No, it's a good question. And again, Andrés and I were discussing this earlier today. We've looked at the development trap, right? We don't actually know, is this more prevalent now than say 20, 30, 40 years ago? We definitely know there have been places trapped for a long time. Also during the period of our study and way before. Why only now do we see this translated politically, right? In a way, you need a couple of things in the right place to be able to have a political impact. A couple of things that have happened. There's a growing disenchantment with the mainstream parties. They've become very alike. People feel like the answers they provide are not very convincing. And the longer they are trapped, the more they feel like, well, I've tried voting for this party, I tried voting for that party, neither of them do anything for me. I'll try something more extreme. So I think it's part of the disenchantment of mainstream parties, the more volatile voter allegiances, and also, hate to call it political entrepreneurship, but you need somebody there who's willing to take advantage of that opportunity, to take advantage of people who are disillusioned or are worried about their future and who come up with a simple or simplistic narrative saying, oh, I can fix it, right? All the other ones suck, I'm the best, and you're the real people and I listen to you. So that kind of rhetoric wasn't always there, but it has definitely gained in strength. And then part of that is because many of the mainstream parties don't have a convincing story about that this is a problem and that they're going to fix it, right? And so, yeah, I don't know if development traps have become more common. My guess is probably not. But I do think that there is, and they learn from each other, let's be honest, right? They might not agree on any of their policies. Some love Russia, others hate Russia, but they do learn from the promotional strategies that work. And targeting places that are poor, that have been poor for a long time, or getting poorer over time, is a strategy that works like a charm. And so, in terms of targeting those areas, I think that's new, right? It used to be, you'd have much less targeted campaigns, and now we can micro-target particular areas, and we understand much better what people are persuaded by. And so as a result, I think they have jumped in that and learned from what other similar parties have tried elsewhere to really hone their message and make it as convincing as possible. So a partial explanation at best, but an attempt.
Okay, we are running almost out of time, so you had a short presentation, but a lot of questions, which I think is always good. But I would like to finish with one question for myself, and it goes in the direction of what Diego and Yola were asking online a moment ago. You work for an organization that actually provides the largest territorial development policy in the world by quite some margin. And you work as an analyst for them, actually shaping policy, given mostly the background, the analysis that is going to then determine policy. And the European Union has committed more than anyone else, fundamentally, to promote the development of the least developed parts of Europe. And when we look at the results that you presented, the least developed parts of Europe are not particularly Eurosceptic. They are doing well, and they are, in most cases, also happy with the European Union. But the rich regions of Europe, it comes out, are more Eurosceptic. And on top of that, you have those that are stagnating, those regions that are less dynamic in the development trap, the dynamic I mentioned, that are also unhappy with or there's strongly a strong correlation with the European Union. To what extent is there a need to change policy and focus much more on rich areas as well and declining areas and not just on less developed areas?
Excellent questions, Andrés. You kept the easiest one for last. Let me give a different answer to rich regions than to declining regions. When it comes to rich regions, and I'm half Dutch, and the Netherlands is actually relatively Eurosceptic. I think one of the big challenges, and that's probably also true in the UK prior to Brexit, is that the benefits of the EU for rich regions are not very tangible. The fact that they're part of a single market, the fact that you have free movement of labor and these things, there's no big bridge, there's no opening ceremony, you don't see the money coming directly, but nevertheless, you have a lot more trade, you have a lot more economic activity. So for me, I think what we fail to do is to persuade people in rich regions that their region would be a lot poorer without the EU. I think it's definitely true for the Netherlands, which benefits tremendously from all the trade and both goods and services, and also the movement of people, etc. I think so if we could make that more obvious, the benefits of the EU to rich regions, that would help. I don't think necessarily that cohesion policy needs to invest more in rich regions. I think there's lots of benefits there, but they're just not so obvious. The only positive point I can see in Brexit is that it made more people aware of those intangible benefits than was prior to the case. And that was it really and I'm scraping the barrel here and trying to find benefits or opportunities thanks to Brexit. When it comes to declining regions, I think there is a case to be made that what we're doing now is not enough. And if I look at the declining regions, especially places that have been stuck for a long time, you can almost see a palpable sense of frustration. What to do about these places, I think really depends tremendously on why they're stuck and what their conditions are. I mentioned earlier that you need local participation, both of the residents, but also the economic actors, the firms, in a redevelopment strategy. But it could very well be that the typical thing a local politician will think of when they say, "Oh, we need more asphalt, we need more roads." Well, a lot of these places have plenty of roads. That's not necessarily the issue. So you really need to look, okay, this place is stuck. What's its history? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? And how can the EU help to overcome those? And that you do with local participation, but also with a broader vision. Okay, how does my region compare to the neighboring ones, similar regions in a different country? And that's really what we've been trying to provide through a whole bunch of different work, better data and indicators to allow regions to place themselves in comparison to others. Just one example, every 3 years we publish what we call a regional competitiveness index. We'll be launching that at the end of March, new update. And a lot of regions use that to understand, okay, where are we strong? Where are we not strong? How do we compare to places with a similar level of GDP? And I think that is really key to helping those places. But I think a more vocal commitment and clarity from our side that being trapped or being in relative decline is an issue that we are aware of and that we really need addressing in a structural way, I think is an important change that I would support.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lewis. Thank you very much to all of you for your participation, to all of you that have been watching on our YouTube channel. And remember, we don't disappear. We are back in 2 days' time. This time is going to be in the old theatre. At 6 o'clock, we'll have Pablo Hernández de Clos, the governor of the Bank of Spain and a member of the board of the European Central Bank. We'll be talking about the future of globalization. So I hope to see you all there, and not just all of you, but also those of you that have been watching on YouTube. That would be relevant. Yeah, so see you all on Thursday. Thank you.